Welcome to the CFAIR and NCFAR webinar series. I'd like to welcome all of you to the webinar today titled Global Trade Policy Under the New Administration. My name is Andrew Muhammad. I'm an economist at the University of Tennessee working on agricultural trade policy issues, and I'm also a board member of the Council on Food and Agricultural and Resource Economics, better known as CFAIR. So CFAIR's mission is to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, and outreach in academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. So today's webinar, focused on international trade policy moving forward, is being co-sponsored with the National Coalition for Food and Agricultural Research, NCFAR, and we are glad today that you've taken the time out to join us. And then also at this time, such an event would not be possible without CFAIR's leadership. So I'd like to personally thank Gal Hochman, who's the board chair of CFAIR, as well as our communication strategist, Maxwell Wyckoff. So next slide, please. So now let's talk about our panelists. And I'm quite familiar with every single one, and I've worked with them in some capacity, in some shape or form, whether it's through USDA in my time there or through the International Agricultural Trade Research Consortium. And so at this time, I'd like to just sort of give a background on each panelist. So today we have David Blanford. He's a professor and retired of agricultural and environmental economics with Pennsylvania State University. Next, we have Jason Hoffmeister, who's the advisor to the Secretary of Agriculture on trade policy issues, and we're happy to have him as well. Next, we have also Shauna Reeder, who serves as senior economist in the Office of the Chief Economist, USDA, also working on international trade policy issues. So next slide, please. So here's just an overview of all participants today, also including me, obviously. But at this time, what I'd like to do is to introduce to all of you the acting administrator of the USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service to provide us some opening remarks on issues of trade policy affecting agriculture moving forward. So at this time, I'd like us all to welcome Mr. Daniel Whitley.
Well, thank you, Andrew. And am I coming through okay?
You're good. You're good.
Very good. And thank you for joining us, everybody. I think this is one of the really key topics that's being asked by a lot of our stakeholders and a lot of our customers around the globe. Just where are we going with respect to ag trade policy? And we've given this question some thought, and I am so pleased to share this panel with so many talented, knowledgeable experts today, because you all are going to get some extremely valuable presentations and information. But in our thinking about this topic, we've really come up with what I think are 7 critical factors that will influence U.S. and global ag markets over the next decade. And by chance, 3 of those factors will be presented today. And let me just run through them real quick. First and foremost, no surprise, I think the growth in the middle class around the world will certainly drive demand for U.S. ag products and determine trade amongst countries moving forward. Number 2, China, which you will hear about today, is going to be a very key factor moving forward. I view China as being a fork in the road, and whether or not they're going to embrace their leadership responsibilities, embrace their economic power, or whether they're going to choose a path of isolation, one with not many allies. So I think China and how they interact with the rest of the world, particularly with the United States, will be key to the future of global ag markets. And like I said, you'll hear about that one shortly. Three, real quickly, you won't hear about today, but the role of the US dollar in commodity prices. We've seen record prices, corn, soybeans, wheat, over the last few months. What's going to be the future and the path of those prices? Obviously, stocks are tight, demand is high. We're hearing about some production shortages possibly in the 21-22 crop. So what will the future be of prices? And of course, agriculture is traded in US dollar denomination. The fourth, and I think this is the asterisk one that will be really important moving forward, and one you will hear about today from Mr. Hoffmeister, the role of trade and trade liberalization. Just 7 or 8 years ago, I would have never imagined that governments and countries would use tariffs as a tool to impact policy and to address policy concerns. Is that the new norm? Are retaliatory tariffs the new norm moving forward for countries and governments around the world? I think that's going to be one of the critical questions of how well we can move forward. In that same lane, I think the future of the trade institutions, the WTO, the ability to set, not only set, but follow rules and laws will determine how open markets will be around the world. So I'm really interested in seeing what happens with the role of trade and trade liberalization. Number five, which I also think deserves a really big asterisk, climate change. I do think the stars are aligned. I think the world as a whole is taking climate change seriously. I think agriculture will be a major industry that helps address climate change issues. I think that's going to be some changes to trade and ag trade specifically. For example, with respect to putting land in conservation, how about more land used for organic production, less feed, better feed rations? I think we'll see a really big impact about ag's role in addressing climate change around the world. So that will also influence global ag markets over the next decade. Number six, and we don't have to spend a lot of time on these last two, but number six, biofuels production. Oh my gosh, how the narrative has changed. Where will biofuels be in 10 years from now? Obviously, there's a lot of demand still for biofuel products. What do those trends look like? What will the trends in the automotive sector be? I think there's a lot of really interesting questions that will be answered that will determine the role of biofuels. Will biofuels be part of the solutions of climate change? And last but certainly not least, new products. In this arena, we've seen questions from stakeholders and interested parties lately about plant-based meat products. What about cell cultured meat? Obviously, hemp and CBD oil are new products that we've seen policy set around over the last couple of years. So these are 7 key questions that I think will drive U.S. and global ag markets over the next decade. But again, let me reiterate the 3 you will hear about today with respect to China, climate change, and the role of trade and trade liberalization. So with that, sit back, everybody, get ready to enjoy an amazing show. And Andrew, back over to you.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this event. This is a very important topic that we're addressing, and I hope at least we can try to clarify some of the major issues. I'm going to be focusing on climate change policies. I'm not going to be completely comprehensive. It's a huge subject, but I'll talk about some of the aspects that might be involved in those policies and how they relate to trade and trade measures. Next slide, please. So let's start with the climate policy context. I think we're pretty much aware of what we're dealing with here. First of all, agriculture is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, especially 2 very potent gases, methane and nitrous oxide, from both methane, particularly from livestock production, but also rice production, and nitrous oxide from fertilizer use, as well as the use of livestock manure. So there's a mitigation challenge. I mean, how can we reduce the carbon footprint of agricultural production? It's a major issue. Second thing, of course, which is very important, agriculture is going to face some big pressures from climate change itself. We're going to have changes, obviously, in average temperatures, heat stress, precipitation, extreme events, hailstorms. I mean, we're seeing a lot of these things already. And the climatologists are telling us it's only going to get a lot worse. So agriculture is going to have to figure out ways to adapt to that. All right, so in terms of domestic policies, let's highlight at least 3 of these that people have been talking about quite a bit, not just in the United States, not necessarily even in the United States, but around the world. The first one is government providing financial support for the development of new technology and the adoption of that technology. This is really, really important because research and development is critical both to climate proofing agriculture as well as reducing its carbon footprint. Productivity is going to be absolutely vital if we're going to lower the carbon footprint of agriculture. So that's number one. Number two, a whole series of financial incentives could be provided for adopting new practices, let's say, that are more climate resilient or less emission, more emissions friendly. We can promote the production of low emissions, climate resilient products. Actually subsidize the production of those. And then finally, and of course, this is very, very important for agriculture because we're big user of land. The carbon sequestration possibilities that exist both in terms of production, crop production, as well as diverting land from, let's say, crops to other sequestration activities like growing trees. And then finally, regulations and taxes. Let's not forget these because economists, of course, are particularly keen on the idea that if you don't price greenhouse gas emissions, if they're not taken into consideration when we're producing goods or consuming them, then that's a problem. And so we could address that through regulations, taxes, or some combination of those things like cap and trade. Next slide, please. Let's move on to the trade policy context. Major issue, of course, at least for those of us who've been working on trade for years, is how do the measures, domestic measures, relate to obligations under existing WTO rules? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. First of all, there is, of course, a specific agreement on agriculture in the WTO, and this contains some important provisions relating to the policies that I've just outlined. The first thing is that if we're talking about financial support for R&D, also for extension activities and things like that, education, those things are covered under the green box in the agreement on ag. In other words, they're viewed to be minimally distorting for trade, and so they're notified to the WTO, but there are no limits placed on them. Also, we can make payments under specific environmental programs. So, for example, things like the Conservation Reserve Program. If we want to divert land, let's say, into carbon sequestration uses, then if we pay farmers to do that, we report those payments, but they're not limited. They're in the green box. Now, other things, of course, if we're actually going to pay, let's say, to produce specific products, or we're going to subsidize farmers to adopt particular practices affecting particular crops, then these could fall under the so-called amber box, which is they're potentially trade distorting because they can increase production. But even so, they have to be notified, but they're only actionable. In other words, they're only subject to limitation directly under the subsidies agreement if they have adverse effects on trade partners. And those trade partners, of course, can lodge a complaint. A case can be brought to the WTO, which will then be considered, providing we can get the dispute settlement mechanism back in working, of course, because at the moment it's not. And then finally, though, what about border measures? Some countries are talking about these things. Border measures to restrict imports based on emissions content, and that's a key issue for the United States because we're a big exporter. So if a lot of countries around the world all of a sudden start saying, well, you know, we're going to start restricting imports and we're going to start looking at those emissions content, you know, a footprint, and we're going to start restricting imports. That's obviously a big issue. Okay, next slide. As far as the imports are concerned, we do have some very important disciplines in the WTO, principles basically that are applied. The first one, which is fundamental to the whole agreement, is non-discrimination, right? So what this says is you can't discriminate between like products. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, from trading partners. So you can't treat them differentially with respect to tariffs. I can't impose, I'm not supposed to anyway, impose a different tariffs on, say, imports from country A versus imports from country B if they're members of the WTO. Now, like products, what's that? Well, like products, as far as the agreements are concerned, is beef, right? Corn is corn. It doesn't matter what the environmental footprint of those things is, you know, what the emissions that they generate, when they're traded, they're basically considered to be the same product. That's very important. Second thing is, if we're going to be using taxation and regulation to do something about climate change, then we can't discriminate between domestic and foreign products. All right, so let's take an extreme case. Suppose we wanted to impose a consumption tax on beef. That's been talked about actually in some countries around the world. Well, okay, if you do that, it's got to be, the tax has got to be imposed on domestic beef or imported beef. You can't just put it on imported beef, even if it's higher emissions involved in its production. So that's very important. Now, one little proviso, I'm not going to get into great detail of this, but there is an exception provision. A couple of things here that are noted in the final part of the slide, where it is possible, at least to some extent, although it doesn't seem to be hugely flexible in the way it's been interpreted, to use, let's say, some import tariffs or even bans to address some environmental issues. But again, that's not something that's currently highly viable. Let's put it that way. Okay, next slide. Since I'm an economist, of course, I have to show some pictures. I have to draw some graphs, and this is what an important example for what I'm going to talk about in terms of this like products treatment issue of imports. In the top part of this diagram, what I've done is simple representation. Top left-hand side is a domestic market for a product, and on the right, we got the international market. In other words, what's happening with imports into this country. And what we're doing here is we're imposing some type of regulation or cost increasing regulation or tax that causes the supply curve to shift to the left. So you can see that supply curve shifts from S to S prime. What that does, of course, is it cuts domestic production. Demand is unchanged because we face a constant import price. And so what happens is we have more imports, right? So the excess demand curve on the right panel shifts to the right. Now, what's the implications of this when we're thinking about greenhouse gas emissions? Lower left part of the panel shows a possible relationships that we might have in terms of the domestic market. And that green line that's running out there shows how many emissions are generated as we increase domestic production. And as you can see, it's quite substantial. The bottom right part of this shows two possibilities for imports. One, the red line, the steep red line, is where the emissions intensity of imports is greater than the emissions intensity of domestic production. The green line, which is closer to the horizontal axis, shows the opposite case where imports are less emissions intensive. Now, it's very important to think about this because very often when people have talked about imports increasing if we do something domestically to control emissions, they said, well, this is carbon leakage, right? We're cutting our own carbon emissions, but we're leaking carbon in the rest of the world by increasing our imports. But actually, if you think about this in a little bit more detail, There are really two different cases which are very, very important. One is the top green line on the bottom right would actually give carbon reallocation, right? What we would be doing is replacing high emissions domestic production with low emissions imports, which in terms of global mitigation is a good deal. On the other hand, if we're moving down that red line, then clearly this is not a good deal. What we're having here is carbon misallocation, and in fact our policy is having a secondary effect of generating more emissions globally. Next slide, please. So what about dealing with this carbon leakage? Countries have been talking about this problem, and they're saying, you know, look, we need to deal with it, but obviously, as I've just pointed out, if we restrict imports just on the basis that they're imports, then we could undermine carbon reallocation, and that's not a good thing. Could we use differential tariffs or import regulations to prevent high emissions imports? Well, probably, you know, technically, of course, you could maybe, but legally, probably not, because they'd be challenged under the WTO. Other countries would say, well, wait a minute, you know, you're taking away everything we've negotiated with these tariffs is now being undermined by what you're doing. So is there a sort of special way to deal with this then? If we're taxing domestic emissions, can we use tax adjustments? In other words, a specific tax adjustment linked to our domestic tax based on carbon content. Next slide, please. Now, I apologize for this one. It's an even more complicated slide, but very, very simply, this is what's going on. In the top left-hand panel, what we're doing is we're going to put on a tax on imports based on carbon content. So in other words, we're going to take the tax we apply domestically, and we're going to say that same tax will be applied on imports, right? So it's non-discriminatory in that sense. Okay, what would this do? Well, actually, it would partly solve the problem we're talking about, because if you look to the top right of this diagram, if there's a supplier that has very high emissions, right, they're going to be paying a very high tax, and so basically they won't be competitive in the market. They'll be frozen out of the market. So we get rid of that, you know, that a big part of that potential carbon misallocation problem. Imports, however, would decline. The emissions intensity would decline. That's all the purple shaded stuff there. And that would give us some carbon reallocation. It wouldn't give us as much as the previous case, you know, when we don't apply the tax at the border, but it would still give us some of it. So it wouldn't completely eliminate the benefits of the domestic policy. Next slide, please. Getting very close to the end now. In fact, this is pretty much my last slide. It's important to realize really that in terms of the trade policy questions here, the Paris Agreement, the climate agreement, while it gives tremendous flexibility to countries as to how they would approach the climate challenges they face, the problem with it is that it's basically a free-for-all, right? I mean, it's a bottom-up approach. Countries can decide what to do. They can decide to do things differently. Some will maybe impose regulations or carbon taxes, and some won't. Not having a sort of a universal approach here is a real problem. It generates tremendous potential for conflict on the trade front. The second thing is that most forms of financial support for mitigation and adaptation would probably not generate strong objections. I mean, if we're pursuing policies in good faith to lower emissions intensity, to increase sequestration and that sort of thing, that's not likely to be hugely production enhancing. And so probably most countries would sort of say, okay, that's fine. Even if it's not part of a specific environmental program, it probably wouldn't be challenged. However, if we're going to start getting into the use of border measures, tariffs, import restrictions, border carbon tax adjustments, to discriminate between imports with different footprints, then that's unlikely to be WTO compliant, because even though we think they're unlike products in terms of WTO rules, they are like products. So without specific exemptions, through that GATT article that I highlighted on one of the slides, or through the use of bilateral agreements. That's another thing we could do, of course. Countries could get amongst the coalition of the willing and say, yes, this is what we'll do. We will impose some standards, for example, and recognize those mutually on products, and they could do that. It's difficult, however, without those sorts of things to address unlikeness legally through border measures. And this is my outro slides, just a little bit of advertising. Next slide, please. If you want to see more of stuff that I've written on this, you'll find it all on researchgate.net, and there's a couple of publications involved here. That's it.
Thank you.
Yes, super. Thanks, David. That was a good presentation, and Daniel for kicking it all off. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the new direction of trade policy, and it's hard for me to do that. We've had an election here, a new president is in place, and we are still figuring those things out. Top to bottom, bottom to top, side to side, 360-degree reviews are underway. And so there's not a lot of specificity we can talk about of the policy directions we're taking. But to use my time here, I'm going to try and put it in context so that we can evaluate some of the questions Daniel and David have raised. So say goodbye to my kids and go to the next slide, please. So first thing is, I want to look back at in the post-war era. And following World War II, we've had very consistent trade policy in the United States. It's been about liberalization. It's been about increasing integration. It's about reducing barriers, encouraging trade. And U.S. agriculture has been a big beneficiary of that. This chart here shows the number of people living in extreme poverty, and the red is the number of people below the line, and the blue is the number of people above the line. And so I'd just like to emphasize this tremendous story of improved human conditions that have accompanied the post-World War II era, of which liberalized trade was a key element. And so that's, agriculture trade is that green bar on the right there, where you can see as we have increased the number of people and increased their lifespans and increased their income, they have consumed more. And so that means for productive exporters like the United States, we've seen big benefits. So that's the context, right, of 1945 up to the turn of the century. Next slide, please. This is just a reminder that greater integration and market opening has benefited U.S. agriculture. This chart here shows U.S. exports under bilateral agreements. The yellow bar is our average exports 5 years average before a trade agreement, and the blue bar is 5-year average after a trade agreement. So it's not surprising that a competitive sector like U.S. agriculture benefits by expanding sales when we do trade agreements. Next slide. A great example of sort of the differential effects of liberalization. India was an original member of the GATT and the WTO, joined in 1948, but it joined under pretty restrictive conditions. Very high bound tariffs exist in India, pretty broad scope for subsidy policies in India. And I'm contrasting it here to China and what we've seen there. So this is a net trade balance. So India is a net exporter to the world of agriculture products, largely because it has been able to exempt itself from integration. It is high tariffs, generous subsidy policies have resulted in limited Indian imports of ag products and have produced surpluses which go out into the world market. Contrast that with China, another continental-sized economy, 1 billion people, fast-growing economy. China joined WTO in 2001 when it looked a lot like India, not a big trader, not much of an importer. But China joined WTO under much more stringent conditions than India did. China has much lower tariffs. It agreed to specific provisions to open its markets, and we've seen the effect of China on the world market. It's this massive net importer of ag products. And so that gets to the point of the global system, the integrated system, the market-oriented, rules-based system has had a big effect on trade in agriculture products when we've gotten countries to buy into it. Next slide. So all that changed in the last few years, right? I think this sort of model of the traditional U.S. trade model was running on fumes by we got to the end of the Bush administration and the Obama administration. And then we had the 2016 election with President Trump, and all of a sudden the metric changed, right? It all of a sudden became trade wars are good and easy to win. We had a president who extolled himself as a tariff man. We had protectionism being spoken about as a positive attribute, you know, and so this is, as Daniel mentioned, just a complete switch from sort of traditional policy. And the metric of successful trade policy became the trade balance. So this chart here shows the U.S. merchandise trade deficit, right? 400, 600, 800 billion dollars a year. And what it shows in the blue bar there is what share oil and gas constituted of that trade balance, right? So you can see that was up to, in 2011 there, half the trade deficit was attributable to oil and gas. Well, what happened after then? The fracking revolution. All of a sudden, we become this massive producer of oil and gas. You can see our trade balance in oil and gas has disappeared. We're actually now a net exporter of oil, but the overall trade balance hasn't moved a lot, right? So I think this just goes to some of the limitations of the protectionist trade surplus, trade balance view of the world, and we need another paradigm. And so now we've had another election. Next slide. In 2020. President Biden is in, and we are doing a review now of our trade policy. We're talking about now of trade policies that reflect our values, trade policies that work for the middle class, trade policies that protect and improve working conditions and the environment. And so that's really our job in government now, is to turn that into a real coherent policy. I'll just talk now about agriculture, some of the considerations for us. So this chart here shows our big markets, right? These are our top customers. There's growth potential in China, maybe some in Mexico, but they're pretty mature markets. The big story for us here has been what happens if we lose a customer. And obviously with the trade wars with China, we had a big decline in our exports there, resulted in the need for serious mitigation programs. So as we design a policy, we need to keep an eye on how do we keep our big markets open, because we notice them when we lose them. Now there's growth potential in these, but the next slide gets to where we do see, next slide, please, the markets of greater potential, right? And so the first 6 jump off the page here, but this is U.S. ag exports in billions of dollars. There's, you know, about 20 other countries where we can export $1 billion or more to, and many of these countries are the growing markets, growing economies, growing populations, countries that have ag production challenges, countries we have a lot of with our style of agriculture, high tech, high productivity, land extensive, row crops, livestock, deciduous fruits and vegetables, processed products. There's a lot of potential for us in these markets. So as we talk about a system going forward, you know, we really are going to talk about institutions. We can't open these markets on a one-off basis. Trade wars, it turns out, are actually quite hard and difficult to win, and we have limited bandwidth on how we can tackle all these countries. So what we really think about is what sort of institutions, what sort of systems can provide consistent, predictable, and open access to these customers for a competitive sector like U.S. agriculture. Next slide, please. So certainly part of the conversation about this is going to be, what is a worker-centered trade policy, a policy that works for the middle class? You know, U.S. farmers, most of them that I know, consider themselves to be workers, consider themselves to be middle class. I know a lot of them are quite asset rich, but maybe cash flow poor. But many people who work in agriculture, seasonal laborers like myself when I was a boy, people in associated industries, transportation, inputs, processing, you know, these are workers in agriculture. These are people who benefit from access to more customers, the ability to increase production, and the ability to find more markets overseas. This chart here is looking at manufacturing, production, and employment. So 2 things jump out at you. One is this secular decline in employment in manufacturing. And 2 is what appears to be some sort of plateau in terms of manufacturing output. You know, we still are a massive manufacturer. We've a lot of dynamic manufacturing industry, but of course it's services that now suck up most of our employment and most of our dynamism. Next slide. So I'll just talk a little bit here about when we talk about the new direction of policy. Clearly, there has been, in the post-war era, competition is fiercer now than it ever has. Concerns about national security and trade are more acute than they ever have been. Unfairness of other trade partners now is something that grates us in a much more painful way than ever has before. And so we are looking at ways that this trade system needs to be rebooted, needs to be refitted to address the realities and the priorities that we have. As U.S. agriculture, a competitive sector, if we are going to stay healthy and growing, we need access to foreign markets. So a lot of the core principles that David outlined are important to us. We don't want to be discriminated against. We don't want to see our products unfairly turned away from foreign markets. But we also have a keen interest in seeing other countries abide by fair rules too. But I'll just close here by pointing out that in some ways the upheaval of the last 4 years has been salutatory, right? That this is there are a number of public opinion polls. They all show the same thing. Gallup, CNN, here's Chicago Council. They all ask basically the question about, what do people think about international trade? And we saw coming out of 2016 and where trade was a real electoral issue, people value it more than they ever have before. So the question really is it's not about not trading. We need to trade. It's about trading on the right terms. And so I think it's helpful that David framed this in terms of climate, because we know that is going to frame a lot of our policy direction in the coming days. A lot about unfair practices in other countries is going to be important, and this concern about middle class, working class workers. And probably the biggest factor, though, is really about China. That is the market that has the greatest short-term potential for us to increase our exports, the market that if we lose it, we feel the pain quite strongly. And so certainly how trading rules affect China is going to be one of our key indicators, and probably a good time for me to hand it off to Sean.
Next slide, please. So this chart here shows U.S. agricultural exports over the past 50 years. Very quickly, kind of roughly outlined it in 4 phases. The first phase, not much activity going on, limited market in China. For the much part of that previous century, we're exporting roughly around $500 million of ag products a year. In 2001, China joins the WTO. I think many of us know this story. Our exports grow astronomically, fueled both by rapid growth in Chinese income, as well as policy reforms. Again, as part of their accession to the WTO, they dramatically reduced their tariffs. They removed many quantitative restrictions. They imposed a series of disciplines on subsidies and other measures. Our exports, though, it sort of capped off in 2012. And here I have I kind of have that arrow in orange. It shows for the last decade, we suffered eroding market share. And here I want to emphasize that this had been under development prior to the trade war. We had market share of 25% in China in 2012. That fell to 20% in 2017 before the trade war. Now, economic factors were at play. There were weaker commodity prices, growing competition from Brazil and other competitors. However, there was also, during that decade, a series of policy measures that contributed to that decline, including China had expanded its subsidies on many ag commodities. There was distortions in quotas, SPS measures like avian influenza restrictions, biotech restrictions on corn and DDGs that, among other factors, played a role in knocking off our exports. That was, again, ultimately capped off by the trade war. Next slide, please. So the trade war did lead to a crash to our exports to China. It wasn't only just China, other major trading partners hit us with tariffs, but China was by far the largest component of this. In a study myself and other co-authors published in AEPP a few months ago, we econometrically estimated the impacts of these tariffs. We estimated this was at least $27 billion over the past two some years. Soybeans was by far the hardest hit, but there was a wide swath of commodities that was disrupted. And also keep in mind that many of these tariffs are still in effect, at least officially speaking. Next slide, please. However, we have seen very significant recovery in our exports to China. So in January of 2020, the U.S.-China Phase 1 agreement was signed. For agriculture, elements of this agreement include $40 billion of purchases of U.S. ag products per year. There was also, very importantly, specific commitments to address structural non-tariff barriers on a wide range of products, including livestock, grains, horticulture, biotech, and other areas. Additionally, after the agreement went into force, China also announced a tariff waiver program that would exempt retaliatory tariffs on approved products. And this chart here on the right, it shows that red line shows our 12-month rolling sum agricultural exports to China. I present in this manner to see annualized levels at monthly level frequency with the latest data. I presented, so as we can see in this figure, prior to the trade war, our exports were hovering around $22 billion to China. This plunged under the retaliatory tariffs to about $9 billion in mid-2019, but picked up significantly in the latter half of 2020. Again, there was COVID, there was ASF, there was other factors going on at the time. But what we can see is in the last 12 months of data, so this is latest data as of April 2021, our exports have surged to $33 billion. And let me quickly clarify that this doesn't include fishery or forestry, so it's not exactly in those phase 1 buckets that some of you may be aware of. But this already exceeds our current trade forecast to China. This one is going to be updated next week, in fact. But undoubtedly, our exports have surged tremendously over the past few months. Nevertheless, I would also mention, though, that our market shares may still look like they're recovering. So in the blue line, it shows our market shares in China. It was about 20% before the trade war. And again, it was already eroding the previous years before that. This did fall to 7% at the lowest point of the trade war. Now it's back up to 19%. Next slide, please. Another point that should be recognized is that market factors also play a major role behind the recent surge in China's purchases of U.S. products. First, China's still dealing with African swine fever. They have been rebuilding their herd supply, have been importing a lot of foreign pork, including from the US. But as we can see, they still face a rather significant shortage of pork, at least relative to 2018 levels. Secondly, if you look on the right-hand side of this figure, there's been some changing dynamics in their feed situation. For years, China used to produce much more corn feed than it used to. And much of this had to do with their subsidy and stockholding programs. Their balance sheet appears to have changed recently. China's feed situation now appears that it seems like they're using a lot more than they're producing. They're in net deficit mode. We can see this in their prices. We can see them from what they're buying, from this. Part of this, again, is connected with African swine fever. They're rebuilding their herd supply. They're modernizing a lot of their operations that are becoming much more grain intensive instead of feeding swill that they previously used to do more intensely. And there's also, of course, some speculation and uncertainty behind the actual size and quality of their stocks. Let's jump to the next slide, please. But one thing is clear is that they're buying, and they're buying big of U.S. commodities. This chart here shows our accumulated sales to China. The red line shows the running totals that have been either shipped or booked for this marketing year. We've been seeing huge sales all year long. You can see here that corn has been going through the roof. We have commitments for over 22 million metric tons of corn for this marketing year alone. China recently booked over 10 million metric tons, not shown on this chart, for next marketing year, for crop that is currently being planted. And so keep in mind, China's TRQ is only 7.2 million metric tons, and that's for the whole world. So we are already well past that just for corn. And it's not just corn. We look at soybeans, cotton, sorghum, beef, wheat. We've been shipping, we've been booking a lot of sales far exceeding previous years. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is my last slide. And so the question I sort of want to leave off with is whether or not this purchase boom that we've been seeing, whether, will it keep going? Is this a one-off, or is this a permanent shift? I mean, moving forward is going to rest upon both market and policy factors with wildcards on each end. For example, on the market side, it's not clear to us the extent of ASF, the spread, how fast they're rebuilding their herd, nor is clear to us, what exactly is going on in the China feed balance sheet. It's not clear to us how much stocks that they have and how much that net deficit is really driving those markets. On the policy side, it will depend upon how well they continue to implement phase one agreements, phase one commitments. They have already implemented 50 of the 57 structural commitments. Will they continue along this path, or will they start diverting from these aims, revert back to some of their previously stated self-sufficiency type of objectives and erecting non-tariff type of barriers like we've seen before in the past? What is clear, though, is that Chinese consumers would benefit from additional US and foreign agricultural supply. We can see this in their prices. If you look at those charts below, the red lines, those are the prices that Chinese consumers and wholesalers and others pay, whereas the blue line is our prices for corn. Corn costs $12 a bushel in China. Their pork prices are double what they are here in the U.S. Same with same with wheat prices. They're about double what we have here. Many U.S. food products are recognized as premium brands in the Chinese market. So it's clear that they need and want U.S. products. But again, markets cannot bridge these gaps alone. Liberalization is not easy. That is why phase one is so crucial. At the end of the day, it's going to be both a combination of economic and policy factors. This is how it was before. This is how it will keep being, and this will continue to drive our ag relationship with China. So thank you. I'll stop there. I'll turn it back to you, Andrew.